You are listening to Fox Radio 910 and 104.3. Welcome to Front Porch Tales, sponsored by Crowning Touch Senior Moving Services of Roanoke, Virginia. My name is Linda Balentine, the president of Crowning Touch and your host for this series. I travel into the mountains to interview the people of Appalachia and collect their share of memories. So now, we invite you to sit a spell with us and listen to stories, both historical and current, that emanate from the heart of Appalachia. All right, Lester. We're resuming Front Porch Tales, but now we're inside, cuddled up around the wood stove. Bo is relaxed, the little dog at your feet. Snow flurries outside. And it's the day after Thanksgiving.
What a wonderful time of the year.
It's a day after Thanksgiving, and scheduled for today, we're going to talk about apple cider, apple trees, how important the apple was to everybody out here, and then maybe we'll get a chance to talk about maple syrup making, and we'll just carry on. But why don't you are an apple guy. I mean, you were grafting heirloom apples onto trees. Tell us all about that.
Yeah, apple time. I mean, I'm already this time. What a wonderful time of the year, and happy Thanksgiving to everybody, or post or whatever Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
But apples in the fall of the year in the mountains, one of the biggest events and times of everybody that lived out here is apple cider making time.
That's correct. And all the wildlife enjoyed it too. I mean, the deer, it was great actually. Don't you think that they use that, the lure of the apples to get some of their meat for the winter?
You know, they absolutely,
Sure. I mean, the deer came right on into your orchard.
The number one reason for apple tree planting was survival.
Right.
I mean, that's the whole bottom line, because It wasn't just for making cider. You make pies out of it. You can make apple butter out of it.
They dried it.
You can make apple sauce out of it. Dried apples was very popular.
Right.
Stored apples. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Storage apples. Okay.
How did they used to store apples? To keep them through the winter, they did it in the root cellar. But what did they?
In the root cellar.
Did they wrap them up, put them in sand? What did they do with them?
No, they didn't have anything like that. They didn't have. I mean, maybe you had enough. You could use sawdust.
Okay, yeah.
To store your vegetables in, and it insulated the vegetables. They could actually be kept in the ground. You can keep vegetables all winter long.
That's right.
If you had a deep enough pile of sawdust covering them. Mm-hmm. And as long as you could get to it, you could go out there and pull any kind of root crop out. Carrots, onions, turnips, beets.
Yep.
I mean, as long as they were covered, they wouldn't freeze and rot. Eventually they would, but they'd make it through most of all of the winter. Or you could harvest them and put them in baskets and fill the baskets with sawdust. And as long as the vegetables weren't touching each other, they would, one happened to rot. The sawdust absorbed the rot and didn't interfere with the vegetable next to it.
Right.
Same with the apples, if you wanted to do it that way. However, one of the key things about apples are, and this is with a big lesson,
you don't store a bruised one?
You cannot have a bruised apple.
That's right.
A bruised apple will not store.
That's correct.
And the other thing is, certain apples stored, certain apples didn't.
Right.
So your early apples, like Pippins and, I'm trying to think, going blank here on them.
Well,
early Pippins, certain apples. There was apples for all the seasons.
Golden Delicious were applesauce apples. They didn't really store those.
They weren't.
They stored the stamens and the wine saps and
the smokehouses, right? And the Dutchmans and the gingers and the Hughes crabs. And
what about Pound Sweets? Did you ever hear about Pound Sweet? It was a real famous apple out here in the mountains because they really were almost a pound. They were huge apples, right?
Yes.
And I don't know whether or not those were storable or not, but
they were only good as a filler for making apple butter.
Okay.
That's all they were used for.
And maybe juicing.
They were not really that juicy.
Some are pithy apples.
They were
and they
very
don't have much.
These things, and those apples you're talking about, huge. And forgive me due to my age, I'm kind of going blank on the Wolf River.
Oh, okay.
They're called Wolf Rivers.
Oh, wow.
And the Wolf Rivers were, like you said, a pound or 2 pounds a piece.
Right.
3 pounds. And I'm not kidding, 3 pounds. And they were just huge. But they really didn't have much juice. They didn't have a whole lot of flavor, and they were used as a filler.
Gotcha.
And, then you have certain apples that were grown for cider. You had certain apples that were for the early season apples, your Pippins, what we called a strawberry delicious or a Tolliver, just, different varieties that you find out in these orchards. Back years ago, every homestead, every household had an apple orchard. Guess what? Today, they're all gone. All the old homesteads, all the apples. So a lot of varieties. There were so many different varieties, hundreds of different apple varieties. And a lot of them were, just not identifiable. We don't know. We don't know what they are. But we know them by, what their appearance, what the inside looks like, their flavor, etc. But we don't really know what some of the varieties are. And there's one, excuse me, there's one variety in particular that we called it a strawberry delicious. That was an early apple, and it was a light-skinned, almost white-skinned apple. Mm-hmm. And if you sliced it, the fruit inside was very white, and it had lines of red, like strawberry lines in it, and it literally tastes like strawberry.
Wow.
It was my favorite apple.
And there was another apple that they used to talk about that I think I saw like 50 years ago when I was trail riding through the mountains. The apples were very, very, they were almost black-skinned. They weren't black.
They're called black twigs.
Okay.
And that was the name. Very good late apple, very good cider apple. My daughter's favorite apple in her orchard that we've kept.
Aren't some of those, I haven't ridden the hills in a long time, but even if there were a few live branches, couldn't you save and graft?
Yes.
With that, in other words, you would take a branch from that tree.
You would take
the end of the branch.
You take a new growth.
Right.
It should be new growth, and of that season.
Right.
So that the next spring, that it was from the previous season, a new growth branch or sprig off of the branch. That's what you used for the next season's grafting.
Okay.
Now, grafting techniques, there was all kinds of different grafting techniques.
What did you do? You used to graft a lot of apples.
I used to do split. I used to use one of the situations. Here's some interesting things. If you want to figure out what the apple is, you would graft to already a mature tree, to one of the branches on the mature tree.
Right.
So within 1 year, you would have apples.
And you could check it out. Yeah,
and you could tell what the variety was, if you liked it, whether it was something you wanted to propagate.
Right.
And you didn't have to wait 6 or 7 or 8 years for a tree to grow up before it became mature enough before it produced apples.
Very cool.
So that's an orchard's
orchardist trick.
Yeah. I forget what
it's a workaround. It's a hack. It's an orchard hack.
Arborist secret, that you can do. You can drill a hole in a branch, and the hole could be the size of your graft, and you stick your graft into the hole as long as you're matching the green, what they call the cambium layer inside of the graft, the tree. So you have the heartwood inside of a tree, and the heartwood is the remains of all of the previous year's growth. Mm-hmm. And then you have the growth of the tree, the living part is the inside, the first layer of bark, from the outer bark to the inside. The inner green part's the cambium layer. The outer bark is, of course, the bark.
Right.
And so you're trying to match the green part with the green part. As long as you're doing that, your chances of a good graft, and you seal it with wax or you seal it up with whatever they had at that time.
Did you dip it in anything? Did they ever dip it in honey, or is that an old wives' tale?
I've never heard about dipping it in honey
anything like that. Okay.
I have done grafts where they use tar. Once you put it in, you want to protect it so that the air or insects.
You don't want any bacteria and stuff getting in.
You don't want any bacteria. You're trying to give it an opportunity. You don't want a long graft. You want something small so that wind is not affecting it and shaking it and moving it. Even though you can, and it has a better chance of taking.
Right.
But I have grafted larger branches to branches and stuff.
Wow.
But not with a lot of success.
Right.
But we learned, we come in here, we used to roam all these old on our hikes. we roamed through all in rides when we used to ride on the horses. We'd go through these old orchards, and we'd be picking the apples and we'd see which ones were early apples. I didn't really know what an early was, a mid-season apple, a late season, I didn't know what keepers were, but you had certain varieties that would keep, all winter long. They were very hard. And then you had certain apples that were called cider apples, like your old smokehouses and your wine saps. And those are some of my two favorite for cider.
But a mix of apples, because you had to gather from everywhere.
People liked it.
They liked the mix.
You took what you had.
That's right, you did.
If you were fortunate enough, you had enough on one tree, and depending on the year, whether we had apples or not, because it's a real touchy time in the springtime when the blossoms come out on the apple tree, that if we have a late frost or a freeze, the blossoms die and the fruit does not set, and you have no apples. So
that's
you could
disaster.
go through a year or two, and that's very disappointing because, it's going to be, but there's always, it's kind of interesting. The good Lord always finds a spot.
Yep.
And finds a few trees.
That's right. There was some hollow or something that was down protected, or something else that was higher up, or the sun shone late on it and kept it from freezing. And we also had pears.
We had pears.
We had pears and plums.
You had plums. You had all kinds of, you had berries. You had raspberries and blackberries. Of course, we had blueberries, which are considered huckleberries. We had service berries. We had talked about that in June.
What kind of berries?
Service berries.
Oh, the service berries.
We call them service berries around here. And you had mulberries. Had a lot of different fruits and so forth that were
pawpaws.
We gathered all that. I mean, that was your survival. I mean,
that's right.
We're not going to a grocery store here now.
Right.
I mean, if you gathered it, you put it up. You could can it. You could dry it. Usually those are your two main ways. If you couldn't, canning before used to be, jars and wax before lids were available. And then lids became, available. Or you dried your fruit. You dried your green beans and reconstituted them with water and brought them and then used it. That's what you did. Apples.
They pickled a lot too.
And pickles.
They pickled a lot, and they pickled
cabbage,
beets,
making kraut. My gosh, kraut time.
That's right.
And was this time of year, the fall. Everybody made kraut, and the thing was, kraut could be kept in a crock and eaten all winter long out of a crock.
That's correct.
It didn't need, because of the fermentation process.
It was just salt and water, right?
Salt and water, and it was very resistant to any kind of bacteria and molds and all that.
So let me ask you a question. Let's look back 50 years and tell me about what was on your Thanksgiving table. What was there? In other words, there would be applesauce, and there certainly would be apple pies.
Oh, there was apple pie.
And apple cider in the barrel.
Oh, we're
cellar.
We're all drinking and partying on the hard apple cider. Let's see. We're getting butternut squash. We have the pumpkin pie. So we have local deer meat. All we could eat at that time. The only meats we had, we didn't have beef, and we didn't have any cattle.
Right.
So the only thing for meats was available were eating groundhog, or having raccoon, or eating rabbit, eating squirrel gravy.
That's right.
Or having deer.
And deer jerky. We had deer jerky.
Jerky, making jerky, absolutely. And so typical Thanksgiving would be, we go out and harvest a turkey.
And pull potatoes out of the ground. I would gather Brussels sprouts, which would still have the sprouts on them, the little cabbage heads. I would go and pick those.
Absolutely.
And bring those in. And I would pull in some carrots.
Yep.
It was just you take a walk through the garden.
Take a walk through the garden, whatever you had or whatever you put in the root cellar. You had a big pot of venison stew on there on top of the wood stove. And in the oven, you had a nice turkey that was in there with onions and carrots and taters and everything in there. And on the stove, you had pumpkin pies coming in and out of there, apple pies coming in and out.
Yeah, you had biscuits.
Hey, you got to realize, we didn't have refrigerators.
That's right.
We had no refrigerators. So as it was cool, I mean, we kept stuff out in the kitchen. We kept them out there in the pantries. We used to talk a pie pantry, or it was that's where you
pie
kept
safe. You
that's
would
where
keep
you
stuff
kept your
in there.
pie.
And there would always be, for instance, we had a closet under the steps that was right next to an outside wall facing north.
There you go.
And it stayed very, very cool, but it didn't freeze because it was close enough to the wood stove, and we could control it by opening the door here and there. So we didn't even have to go to an outdoor root cellar. We had that
root cellar. Well, that's a whole nother story. That's a root cellar is life to a homestead.
That's correct.
Life to a homestead, because that's where you put your cider. It's where you put your apples. Going back to the apples.
That's correct.
We would go in that when those apples are ready to go, and the ones that we want, and we knew that were good keepers, we'd climb the trees, pick the apples, and be throwing them down to somebody catching them.
Right.
Because they couldn't be bruised.
That's
if they
correct.
were bruised, they were set aside to be made into applesauce and pies and stuff to
And
be
juice,
used
yep.
quickly. If they weren't bruised, they got put in the baskets and in the root cellar for long-term storage.
And people shared their orchards with each other. In other words, sometimes your orchard would have a certain predominance of a certain type of apple, and you couldn't process it all fast enough. So you would let your neighbors know, and we would get invitations to come pick. And especially if there was either some early frost or was starting to get cold and the apples were dropping and they were on the ground and they didn't want to see them spoil. And I remember going on mild days and fighting off swarms of yellow jackets who were just as eager to get to them as we were.
So the big event was making cider.
Right. Oh, yes.
I mean, all of the other food and all that was wonderful, but what everybody looked forward to was making apple cider.
And we would gather the apples in great big feed sacks.
And feed sacks, or
those
whatever you
feed
baskets,
sacks.
whatever you had.
That's right.
And the feed sacks. So anywhere, the amount of how much you had to get an idea of what you needed in volume in order to get apple juice out of them. Number one was dependent upon how much juice the apples had.
Right.
Because in certain years they had more juice than other years.
Right.
Depending on drought or whatever the events of the weather was going on. But usually we gather anywhere from 9 feed sacks.
Oh, yeah.
To 14 feed sacks for 1 barrel of cider.
Wow. Okay.
And a barrel of cider was 55 gallons.
Right.
And we got our barrels from people go over to the old whiskey plants and processing distilleries and so forth, and the used barrels, because once the whiskey was taken out of the barrels, they didn't use them again.
Right.
So they discarded them. So we'd get somebody go do a truck run and run and gather a bunch of barrels so that we could use it for cider making, and then everybody would get barrels. So we had barrels, and we would normally do 2 barrels that we wanted to put away for the winter. One we rolled into the root cellar. Both of them went into the root cellar.
Right.
But one was not touched.
Right.
The other one was used for immediate use.
Yeah.
But what we do is gather all the apples. And then back then we had the old folks had apple presses, homemade apple presses. And these things were in ingenuity and I mean marvels in their own right, engineering marvels.
Yes.
Because they were made out of big hewn locust trees that were 8 by 8s that were stuck in the ground with cross members that were mortised and tendon, a bottom one and a top one, and with a platform on the bottom that was higher than the barrel. And then next to that was a homemade grinder that was just a box that was made a funnel with a wheel that had nails in it.
Right.
And then had on one side it had a belt-driven wheel.
Big leather belt.
A leather belt,
they had
a big wide belt
made.
that was used
That's
for
8 inches wide.
That ran sawmill blades and everything off an old steam engine or tractor or something. This particular place we used to take it to was the Botkin family over on Crummett's Run near Franklin, West Virginia. We'd all take our cider there.
Or they would come to you. I mean, I sat on a couple of farms where maybe not the Botkins, but they would, because it was an easy thing to transport. It was a tractor, and their shredder and
they
everything.
could set it up, and they put it in a local area, a particular area where everybody would be easy access.
Right.
For us, we carried it over to the Botkins cider mill because it was a cider time. It was a gathering of everybody coming together, and everybody, it was just such a camaraderie.
It was an event.
It was an event.
It was an actual event. People look forward to it.
It was a celebration.
It was a celebration.
So we go there, and you back your truck. This grinder they had, it had a belt drive that went to a 47 Chevy that was laying, a Ford that was laying on the ground with no doors on it or anything. And it went to the back of the transmission, the seats were out of it, and there was a hole cut in the floor. And they had a belt drive on the back of the transmission, and the belt went from that to the grinding box. And that's how they ran their grinder. And so it could grind, they could do 2 barrels an hour, which is incredible.
Right.
But, they take that, they grind up the mash. The mash would be caught down in a box. The box, they start using shovelfuls that look like a pool table rack. So they had a rack there under where this, like I was telling you about this press. It's 2 big poles. Posts in the ground and so forth, cross members in a bottom plank. They put this square rack on the bottom, put burlap in it, and fill the mash into the burlap, wrap the burlap over, and then build piles, a stack of this.
That's right.
Like I'm talking
burlap
5 feet high.
That's right.
And then at the top, they'd put another big wooden plank at the top with some big 4x4 locust blocks, and that had 20-ton railroad jacks, hand jacks, and they'd use those to crush the pile, to squeeze the pile. And they would get out there, and they'd have that pile up and hook the railroad jacks up with the long poles and start jacking down on this pile.
And then there would be a spout at the bottom.
It would be
to run it out.
The whole pile.
Like a river.
The whole pile would be a river of apple juice running down the sides of the pile, hitting the bottom platform and running out into a funnel that had some burlap in it that would filter it.
Yeah, filter out all the bees and everything else.
And then they just used an old pot, and they'd hand poured into another funnel that was in your barrel and fill up your barrel.
That's right.
And then the barrel get filled up. You would put your bung in it. By all of you know what a bung is. That's the little plug at the top of a barrel.
Like the cork, except it wasn't.
Cork. It's called a bung.
That's right.
And it's still called a bung today. And we'd bung that. And now at that time, you're talking 55 gallons at 8 pounds.
How did we move them? I forget how we
rolled them.
Oh,
we rolled them,
right.
And we used 2 poles or whatever, long poles. And we'd use the poles, and we'd use the barrels and roll the barrel up on these poles to load them into the trucks.
Right, that's
and
right.
then we could lift them up and set them upright on the end. Now, getting them off the trucks and getting them into the root cellars, it was an ordeal.
It was several men.
It was quite an adventure. But we take that and we roll the barrels into the root cellar, and immediately we start drinking off of the sweet juice, the apple juice.
Right.
If you were fortunate, you could can them. Most people didn't can.
Right. You just drank along.
It was part of our life from there into the winter.
Yeah.
We went from nice apple juice, sweet apple juice as it would start, but as the barrels would start to ferment naturally, then the cider would start to change. It would start getting carbonation into the cider. The sugar in the ciders turn into alcohol, and you're learning, and you're having an opportunity to taste the cider as it changes off the first barrel from sweet cider juice all the way until it goes into hard cider.
Right. And then all the way into vinegar once the hard cider is no longer drinkable.
And that.
And we saved the vinegar, and then it would develop a mother.
The mother developed in the barrel.
That's right.
Which is that jelly. It was a big thing of jelly. A lot of people, it's spoiled. No, that's not.
No, it's
that's
microbes.
the natural process.
Mm-hmm. It's like a sourdough yeast.
Exactly right. Except
it's in vinegar.
It's a jelly.
I mean, it's a jelly.
And so as the cider turns far enough until it gets no sugar in it and gets further and further along, then it goes into vinegar.
Right.
And guess where we got our vinegar?
That's right. So then we use that.
And then that's where our vinegar is.
That's right.
And guess what we used to do for our deer meat and so forth?
Well, I don't know what.
Well, we'd take that cider as it was going through the changes, and we cooked with it also.
All right.
So in our turkeys, we'd baste with it. Nice apple juice over the turkey and a wood stove and apple
sure.
An apple juice braise over it. Makes my tongue want to beat my brains out.
I know.
Oh my Lord, there's no food that tastes any better, or breads or anything, that you can't make it any better than what comes out of a wood stove. And I guess it's because it's just so slow cooked and all that. It's just
they would combine apple juice when they made their gingerbread with molasses and the flour. And you would have great, they actually used it to cook. They used everything. I used it in my pumpkin pies. We just, it was when it was still sweet.
Absolutely.
But you just used it for everything.
So talk about celebration time.
That was.
You knew what it meant. You knew what all this work was representing. And of course, when the hard cider got there and it was full of alcohol, now we had let the good times roll.
There was plenty of thanks in our Thanksgiving.
There was a lot of thanks in our Thanksgiving.
There was.
And some of the old timers would put, grapes in it and extra sugar in it to boost up all the alcohol and content of it. And I mean, that was your party juice.
That
was our party juice.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we couldn't afford anything else. That's what we had.
That's right.
Now, here's an interesting fact, and I really want to set the record straight.
Okay.
So that other barrel that we're talking about that's in the root cellar was left to ferment.
Right.
All the way to hard cider.
Right.
The most alcohol it can get.
Right.
In the dead of winter, we'd take that barrel and we'd roll it outside.
And what? And then what?
What do you think it would do? It would freeze.
Oh.
Everything in it froze.
Yeah.
But what didn't freeze was the alcohol.
Oh, okay. So then you would
So we'd
drain
pop
that
a
off.
hole down in it, get a siphon, drain out that alcohol, and that was pretty much pure alcohol.
Oh gosh.
Well, you know what that's called?
No.
That's Applejack.
Oh, okay. That's Applejack. That's
now
a good place.
You know what Applejack is.
I do know what Applejack is, and everybody got jacked up.
And that's what we had. Or if we were fortunate enough, we get to, we're hippies.
Yeah, we got to end it.
We're the early grow pot guys.
I know. We got to end it. God bless you. This is a good
bless
place
you
to end.
too.
And enjoy a happy Thanksgiving holiday,
Thank
everybody.
you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to Front Porch Tales, courtesy of Crowning Touch Senior Moving Services of Roanoke, Virginia, the only moving company with a consignment shop, auction house, and real estate division. We are a one-stop shop for any senior making a move. Check out our website at crowningtouchusa.com. Or if you are planning a move, call Anna at 540-982-5800 to arrange a free estimate. Our consignment shop is open Tuesday through Saturday, and we accept items on appointment and offer pickup and delivery. And don't forget to check out our monthly browse and bid auctions at 6712 Williamson Road, Roanoke, where you can bid online on over 1,700 items each month. Meanwhile, let's get back together next Friday at noon for more Appalachian Tales from the Front Porch on Fox 910 and 104.3.